4 hours into driving to my mother-in-law's birthday, my husband called, "Turn around. My mom doesn't want you there." This was right after I'd bought her a mansion. I replied, "Understood." An hour later, I showed up with an unpleasant surprise. "Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button." The call came exactly 4 hours into what should have been the most triumphant drive of my life. I was behind the wheel of my Honda Accord, the back seat loaded with Eleanor's birthday gifts, including the deed to a $380,000 mansion I'd just purchased for her 78th birthday. My phone buzzed, and Tom's name flashed on the screen. "Maggie, you need to turn around," he said without preamble. No hello, no explanation. Just that flat, emotionless tone I'd learned to dread over our 25 years of marriage. "What do you mean, turn around? I'm almost to Millbrook." I glanced at the GPS. 15 more minutes to Eleanor's current assisted living facility, where we were supposed to surprise her with the news that she'd never have to worry about housing again. "Mom called an emergency family meeting. She doesn't want you there." The words hit like ice water. "She doesn't want me there. Tom, I just bought her a house, with my inheritance money from my grandmother's estate." "I know, and we appreciate that, but she's made her decision. James agrees with her. It's better if this stays between blood family." Blood family. After a quarter-century of marriage, thousands of family dinners, and countless holiday celebrations where I'd smiled and nodded while Eleanor made passive-aggressive comments about my cooking, my housekeeping, my inability to give her precious son children, I was still not blood family. "So what am I supposed to do with the house, Tom?" "We'll figure it out later. Just come home." I sat there on the shoulder of Route 9, hazard lights blinking, watching other families drive past on their way to Sunday celebrations. Normal families who actually wanted each other's company. "Understood," I said finally. I hung up without saying goodbye, made a U-turn, and drove exactly 7 miles to the Millbrook town center. But instead of going home like Tom expected, I parked outside Henderson Real Estate and walked inside with the deed still warm in my purse. "Mrs. Davidson!" Barbara Henderson looked up from her desk with surprised delight. "Congratulations on your purchase. How did Eleanor like her surprise?" "Change of plans, Barbara. I need to put the property back on the market immediately." Barbara's smile faltered. "Oh, did something happen with the inspection?" "You could say that." "And Barbara, I want to list it for $420,000. Cash offers only. But that's $40,000 more than you paid this morning." I smiled, feeling something sharp and satisfying unfold in my chest. "I know. The market's hot, isn't it?" An hour later, I was back in my car with a new listing agreement and Barbara's promise to call every cash buyer on her list. My phone had been buzzing constantly. 7 missed calls from Tom, 3 from Eleanor, 2 from James. I ignored them all. Instead, I drove to the one place I knew they'd never think to look for me. The parking lot of Davidson Construction, Tom's family business. The same business that had been struggling financially for the past 5 years, according to Tom. The same business that apparently couldn't afford to give Eleanor the comfortable retirement she deserved. Sitting there in the shadow of the building that bore my married name, I opened my laptop and began researching something I should have looked into years ago. The Davidson family finances. What I found in the first 10 minutes made my hands shake with fury. Davidson Construction wasn't struggling. According to public records, they'd had their best year ever in 2023, with profits exceeding $2 million. Tom and James each drew salaries of $180,000 annually, plus bonuses. They weren't poor. They were just greedy. My phone rang again, Tom's name on the screen. This time, I answered. "Maggie, where the heck are you? Mom's worried sick." "Is she? How thoughtful of her to worry about someone who's not blood family." "Don't be dramatic. You know she didn't mean it like that." I laughed, a sound that surprised even me with its bitter edge. "Actually, Tom, I think she meant it exactly like that. Just like she meant it when she told me my casserole tasted interesting at Thanksgiving. Just like she meant it when she suggested I might be more comfortable staying home from Christmas last year." "Maggie, you're overreacting." "Am I? Well, here's something that might help you understand my reaction. I just listed Eleanor's new house for sale, for $40,000 more than I paid for it." The silence on the other end stretched so long, I thought he'd hung up. "You what?" "You heard me. Effective immediately, Eleanor can stay in assisted living. I'll be keeping my grandmother's inheritance money for myself. Blood family only, right? Maggie, you can't be serious. Mom was just emotional today. Family dynamics are complicated. You're right, Tom. They are complicated, especially when your husband's family has been lying to you about money troubles while pulling down seven-figure profits. Another silence. Longer this time. I don't know what you think you found, but Davidson Construction's annual revenue. Public record, Tom. Amazing what you can discover when you actually bother to look. I hung up and turned off my phone. For the first time in years, I felt completely, blissfully alone. No more pretending Eleanor's barbs didn't hurt. No more swallowing my pride while Tom chose his mother's comfort over his wife's dignity. No more being the family ATM while being treated like the family disappointment. The house would sell quickly in this market. Barbara had already called with 2 interested buyers. By tomorrow evening, I'd have $420,000 in my account, and Eleanor would still be exactly where she'd always preferred me to be, outside the Davidson family circle. But that was just the beginning, because sitting in that parking lot, staring at the building that represented everything the Davidsons had hidden from me, I realized something important. If they'd lied about the business finances, what else had they been lying about? The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 25 years of marriage. I went through Tom's personal belongings while he was at work. Not because I was looking for evidence of an affair. Tom barely had enough imagination for his current life, let alone a secret one. I was looking for financial documents he'd hidden from his supposedly dramatic, overreacting wife. What I found in his locked filing cabinet, the key was taped under his desk drawer because Tom had the security instincts of a golden retriever, made Eleanor's birthday snub look like gentle teasing. The first folder contained tax returns going back 7 years. Not the simplified versions Tom had always shown me when I asked about our finances, but the complete returns prepared by their accountant. Our accountant, technically, since my name was on them too. According to these documents, we weren't just comfortable, we were wealthy. The construction company had been paying Tom dividends on top of his salary, totaling over $300,000 annually. While I'd been living on the household allowance Tom gave me each month and shopping at discount stores because he insisted we needed to watch our spending, he'd been collecting more money in bonuses alone than most people saw in 3 years. The second folder was even more enlightening. Insurance policies, investment accounts, a trust fund I'd never heard of, and property deeds. Apparently, Tom owned 3 rental properties in addition to our house. Properties that generated $4,500 in monthly rental income that had somehow never been mentioned in our household budget discussions. But the third folder, that was the one that made me sit down hard in Tom's desk chair and pour myself 3 fingers of his expensive whiskey. The whiskey I wasn't supposed to know he kept in his desk because we couldn't afford luxury items. Eleanor wasn't the struggling widow I'd been led to believe. According to the financial documents, she owned her assisted living apartment outright and had a portfolio of investments worth approximately $280,000. Not wealthy, but certainly comfortable enough that she'd never needed my financial help. The woman who'd spent 5 years dropping hints about how expensive her care was becoming, who'd sighed dramatically about the cost of her medications, who'd made me feel guilty for not contributing more to her upkeep, had been perfectly capable of supporting herself. I was still sitting there, staring at Eleanor's financial statements, when my phone rang. Barbara Henderson, calling with the news I'd been expecting. "Maggie, I have wonderful news. We've received 4 cash offers on Eleanor's house, all above asking price. The highest is $415,000, and they want to close within 2 weeks." "Accept it," I said without hesitation. "Don't you want to discuss this with your family first?" "Barbara, let me be very clear about something. I purchased that house with my money, from my inheritance, in my name only. My family has made it abundantly clear that I'm not part of their decision-making process. So no, I don't need to discuss anything with anyone." "All right then. I'll draw up the acceptance papers. Congratulations, Maggie. That's a $35,000 profit in less than 24 hours. After hanging up with Barbara, I called our bank and spoke with our financial advisor about separating my assets from our joint accounts. Not all of our money. I wasn't planning to rob Tom blind. Just enough to ensure my financial independence while I figured out what to do next. Then I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. Hidden behind the real estate documents was a business card for Premier Investigations and a receipt dated 6 months ago, right after my grandmother's death made headlines in the local obituaries. The amount? $8,500. For what services, the receipt didn't specify. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. Premier Investigations. This is Derek. Hello, this is Margaret Davidson. I found your business card among my husband's papers, and I'm wondering what services you provided for him. Mrs. Davidson, I'd need to speak with Mr. Davidson directly before discussing any confidential matters. I understand your policy, but I'm calling because I discovered he hired you to investigate me. I'd like to know what information you provided about my personal finances. The long pause told me everything I needed to know. Ma'am, I can't discuss the details, but I can confirm that we conducted a standard background and financial assessment 6 months ago. 6 months ago. Right after my grandmother passed away and before I received my inheritance. Mrs. Davidson, I really can't. Thank you. That's all I needed to know. I hung up feeling physically sick. Tom hadn't just hidden his own finances from me. He'd hired someone to investigate my financial prospects so he could plan how to access my inheritance money. My phone rang again as I was digesting this betrayal. Tom's name on the screen. This time I answered. Maggie, we need to talk. Can you come home? I am home, Tom. Going through some interesting reading material in your office. I heard him suck in a breath. Maggie, whatever you think you've found, I can explain. Can you? Because I'm looking at tax returns that show you've been earning 4 times what you told me. I'm looking at property deeds for rental houses I didn't know existed. I'm looking at investment accounts worth more than my grandmother's entire estate. It's complicated. It's really not. Tom, you've been controlling our finances while lying to me about our financial situation for years. You even hired a private investigator to research my inheritance prospects before my grandmother was cold in the ground. That wasn't about you. That was about protecting the family's financial future. The audacity was breathtaking. Protecting the family? Tom, you spent $8,500 investigating your own wife like I was a potential criminal. How is that protection? We needed to understand the tax implications. Stop lying. I picked up the investigator's business card. I spoke with Derek at Premier Investigations. He confirmed you hired them for a background and financial assessment right after my grandmother's obituary was published. The silence stretched so long, I thought he'd hung up. Tom, don't do anything rash, Maggie. Come home and let's discuss this rationally. Rationally? Tom, there's nothing rational about discovering your husband has been lying about money while secretly investigating your family's wealth. I'll be out of the house by tonight. Maggie, you're being emotional. We can work this out. I looked around Tom's office, at the evidence of decades of financial deception scattered across his desk. Actually, Tom, I think I'm being logical for the first time in our marriage. I hung up and continued reading through Tom's files. There had to be more. People didn't create this elaborate financial deception and hire private investigators just to avoid honest conversations about money. And in the 4th folder, I found what I was looking for. Bank statements showing regular cash deposits that didn't match any business income I could identify. Payments to something called Griffin Holdings that weren't explained anywhere else in his records. And correspondence with their accountant about maintaining compliance with federal loan requirements during 2020 and 2021. I'd been married to a man who'd been hiding significant income streams while making me feel guilty about every dollar I spent. But as I sat there reading about Tom's financial secrets, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was 18 years old. The thrill of discovery. He wanted to play games with family money? Perfect. I'd been watching him play for 25 years. Now it was time to show him what I'd learned. 3 days later, I was sitting across from Patricia Wells, the estate attorney who'd handled my grandmother's will. Patricia was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd built her practice on protecting people from exactly the kind of financial manipulation I'd discovered. So let me understand this correctly, Patricia said, reviewing copies of the Davidson financial documents I'd found. Your husband has been deceiving you about the family's wealth while controlling your access to money through a monthly allowance system, and he hired a private investigator to research your inheritance prospects. That's exactly right. And I want to know what legal protections I have. Patricia smiled grimly. More than you might think. The private investigator alone suggests financial planning that deliberately excluded you from knowledge of marital assets. That's a serious problem in divorce proceedings. She pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. Tell me about the house purchase. Were you under any coercion or false pretenses when you made that decision? They spent months telling me Eleanor couldn't afford proper housing, that the family business was struggling, and they couldn't help her financially. I was led to believe I was helping an elderly woman in need when she actually has nearly $300,000 in assets. And the purchase was made entirely with your separate inheritance funds? Every penny. I have the bank records to prove it. Patricia nodded approvingly. Good. That makes it easier to pursue restitution if necessary. Now, what outcome are you looking for? Do you want to reconcile with your husband, or are you considering divorce? The question caught me off guard. In all my anger over the financial deception, I hadn't actually considered ending my marriage. But sitting there in Patricia's office, looking at the evidence of how thoroughly my husband had betrayed my trust, I realized something important. I don't want to divorce Tom immediately, I said slowly. I want to give him a chance to come clean and restructure our relationship with complete honesty. But I want legal protection while I find out if he's capable of that. That's a wise approach. What leverage do you have to force that kind of honesty? I thought about the private investigator, about the years of hidden income and assets, about Eleanor's fake financial struggles. I think I have quite a bit of leverage. Actually, Patricia spent the next hour explaining my legal options. Since Tom had hidden marital assets and controlled my access to family finances, I could claim a larger portion of our joint property in any divorce settlement. Since Eleanor had accepted money under false pretenses, I could potentially sue for restitution. Since they'd investigated my finances without my knowledge, I had grounds for invasion of privacy claims. But the most interesting option was one I hadn't considered. There's another approach, Patricia said, leaning forward. Instead of treating this as a victim situation, you could treat it as a business negotiation. You have information they don't want public. You have financial resources they want access to. You could use that position to restructure your family relationships on terms that benefit you. What kind of restructuring? Well, for example, what if you offered to keep their financial deception private in exchange for specific concessions? Full financial transparency going forward, equal control over major family decisions, a formal apology from Eleanor, and a guarantee of respectful treatment. The idea was intriguing. I could expose them for what I'd learned, or I could use it to finally claim my rightful place in the Davidson family hierarchy. Think about it, Patricia continued. After 25 years of marriage, you know these people. You know their weaknesses, their fears, their pressure points. Instead of walking away from everything you've built, you could use that knowledge to rebuild it on your terms. I left Patricia's office with a thick folder of legal options and a completely new perspective on my situation. I wasn't just an angry wife who'd been deceived. I was a woman with substantial leverage in a family that had underestimated her for decades. My first stop was the public library, where I spent 2 hours researching everything I could find about Davidson Construction's business dealings. What I discovered made their financial deception look minor by comparison. The company had received over $800,000 in pandemic relief loans that had been forgiven under the PPP program. According to the public filings, they'd claimed financial hardship and inability to maintain payroll during 2020 and 2021. But their tax returns for those same years showed record profits and substantial bonus payments to the owners. I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd watched enough news coverage to recognize potential fraud when I saw it. Tom and James had received nearly $1 million in federal disaster relief while simultaneously reporting their most profitable years ever. My phone had been buzzing constantly while I researched, but I'd ignored every call. Now, sitting in my car outside the library, I finally listened to my voicemails. Tom, Maggie, please come home. We need to discuss this rationally. Eleanor, Margaret dear, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Tom told me about your little reaction, and I want you to know I forgive you. James. Maggie, Tom's really upset. Whatever's going on between you two, don't drag the family business into it. And finally, Tom again. Maggie, I don't know what you think you've found, but if you're planning to do something foolish with that information, remember that you're part of this family too. What affects us affects you. Was that a threat? After 25 years of marriage, was my husband actually threatening me? Perfect. Because if there's one thing I'd learned from my grandmother, it was that threats only work on people who have something left to lose. I drove to the Millbrook Inn and checked into a room for the week. Then I called Tom. Maggie, thank goodness, where are you? I'm staying at a hotel while I decide what to do with the information I've discovered. Information? Maggie, whatever you think you found. Tom, I've found tax returns, property deeds, bank statements, and evidence that you hired someone to investigate my family's finances. I've also discovered that Davidson Construction received over $800,000 in federal loans while reporting record profits. Would you like to explain any of this? The silence on the other end was deafening. I'll take that as a no, I continued. Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow evening, I want you, James and Eleanor, to meet me at our house for a family discussion. We're going to talk about honesty, respect, and the future of our relationships. Maggie, you're scaring me. Good. Fear is a healthy response when you've been lying to someone for years and they finally figure it out. What do you want from us? I looked out the hotel window at the town where I'd spent 25 years being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family. Tom, I want what I've always wanted, to be treated like family instead of like hired help who occasionally gets invited to dinner. You are family. No, Tom. Family members get honest information about finances that affect them. Family members don't get investigated by private detectives. Family members don't get excluded from important conversations because they're not blood family. I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end. 7 o'clock tomorrow night. Be there and bring your honesty. All of it. As I hung up, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was something much more dangerous. I was strategic. Tom's truck was in the driveway the next evening, along with James's silver BMW and Eleanor's ancient Buick. A family meeting, just like Eleanor had wanted. How convenient that they'd all gathered in one place. I walked into my own house to find them sitting around our kitchen table like a tribunal. Eleanor at the head of the table in the chair I usually occupied, Tom and James flanking her like bodyguards. They'd even helped themselves to my good coffee and the expensive cookies I'd been saving for a special occasion. There she is, Eleanor announced as I entered. Our birthday girl who thinks she can throw tantrums and demand attention. I set my purse down carefully on the counter and placed Patricia's folder next to the coffee pot. 3 sets of eyes tracked my movements with the wariness of people who knew they'd been caught. Good evening, family, I said pleasantly. How nice of you all to make yourselves at home. Maggie, Tom started, but I held up my hand. Actually, I think Eleanor should speak first, since this is about her birthday celebration and all. Eleanor straightened in my chair, clearly prepared for this moment. Margaret, I want you to understand that Sunday's decision wasn't personal. It's simply that certain family business discussions are inappropriate for non-family members to hear. Non-family members, I repeated. That's interesting terminology for a daughter-in-law of 25 years. You know what I mean. Actually, I'm not sure I do. Could you clarify what makes someone family versus non-family in the Davidson hierarchy? James shifted uncomfortably. Maggie, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Oh, but I think we should definitely make this as hard as it needs to be, James. Because I've learned some fascinating things this week about what makes families tick. I opened Patricia's folder and removed the private investigator's business card, placing it on the table where all 3 of them could see it clearly. The silence that followed was spectacular. Where did you get that? Tom's voice was barely a whisper. From your filing cabinet, along with the tax returns showing your real income, the property deeds for the rental houses you forgot to mention, and Eleanor's financial statements proving she could have bought her own mansion. Eleanor's face had gone pale, but she rallied quickly. You have no right to go through private family documents. Family documents? I laughed. Eleanor, according to you, I'm not family. And according to this investigator's receipt, you've been treating me like a subject under surveillance for the past 6 months. I pulled out copies of the documents I'd found. Now, since we're all here, why don't we have that family discussion you didn't want me to hear on Sunday? I'm particularly interested in the part about investigating my inheritance and the timeline for accessing it. Tom reached for the documents, but I was faster holding them back. Touch my property again, and this conversation ends with a call to the authorities about federal loan fraud. That froze all 3 of them completely. You've been busy this week, James said slowly. Very busy. Did you know that public records are actually public? Amazing what you can learn about a company's finances when you know where to look. I sat down at the table, in the only remaining chair, and smiled at my captive audience. Here's what's going to happen, I began. We're going to have complete honesty for the first time in this family's history. And then we're going to negotiate new terms for my continued participation in the Davidson family experience. You can't blackmail your own family, Eleanor sputtered. Can't I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like family has been manipulating me for years. Emotional manipulation, financial manipulation, but manipulation nonetheless. I opened the folder and pulled out the financial summary Patricia had prepared. Let's start with the money, since that seems to be everyone's primary concern. Tom, according to your tax returns, your annual income is approximately $380,000. James, yours is $360,000. The family business is worth approximately $4.2 million and generates nearly $2 million in annual profit. I turned to Eleanor. And you, Eleanor, have a net worth of approximately $280,000, plus your apartment and investments. How did you, she began. How did I find out? Easy. I looked in the filing cabinet where my own husband has been hiding our family's true financial situation for years. Tom found his voice. Maggie, we never meant to deceive you. The finances are complicated. Complicated? I interrupted. Tom, you told me we couldn't afford a vacation while you were collecting $30,000 in quarterly bonuses. You gave me a monthly allowance like a child while you owned 3 rental properties. You let me believe your mother needed financial help while she's worth more than most people's savings accounts. The rental income goes back into the business, James said defensively. Does it? Because according to the bank records, it goes into Tom's personal account, just like the dividends that supposedly don't exist. Eleanor had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke with the imperious tone she'd perfected over 7 decades. Fine, you've discovered that we're not poor. Congratulations. What exactly do you want? Money? Is that what this is about? What I want, Eleanor, is what I've always wanted. To be treated like family instead of like hired help who occasionally gets invited to dinner. You are family, Tom said weakly. No, Tom. Family members get included in important conversations. Family members get honest information about finances that affect them. Family members don't get investigated by private detectives to assess their exploitation potential. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd planted and maintained for 25 years in a house I'd been unknowingly helping to pay for. Here's my offer, I said without turning around. Complete financial transparency going forward. Joint control of all marital assets, including the rental properties, equal voice in family business decisions, and a formal public apology from Eleanor for Sunday's humiliation. And if we refuse? James asked. I turned back to face them, feeling calmer than I had in years. If you refuse, then I contact the authorities about PPP loan fraud, the IRS about unreported rental income, and the local newspaper about how a prominent family investigated and manipulated a woman's inheritance through elaborate emotional fraud. The 3 of them exchanged glances, and I could see them calculating odds, weighing options, trying to find an angle I hadn't considered. You wouldn't actually destroy your own family, Eleanor said finally. Try me. Because here's what the Davidson family had never understood about me. I'd spent 25 years learning to survive their casual cruelty. I'd developed patience, observation skills, and a very clear understanding of exactly how far people would push boundaries when they thought they could get away with it. They'd taught me well. Now it was time for their final exam. The silence stretched for nearly 2 full minutes before Eleanor spoke. You've changed. Margaret, have I? Or have I just stopped pretending that being quietly grateful for scraps was somehow virtuous? Tom cleared his throat. Maggie, assuming we agreed to your terms, how would this work practically? Practically, Tom. It works like a marriage between equals instead of whatever performance we've been staging for the past quarter century. I sat back down and pulled out the detailed notes Patricia had helped me prepare. Joint ownership of all assets means I get added to the deeds of the rental properties. Today, it means I get access to all business financial statements and a voice in major decisions. It means no more secret accounts or hidden income. That's not unreasonable. James admitted grudgingly. Eleanor's apology needs to be public because her disrespect was public. I don't care if it's a letter to the newspaper, a statement at the next family gathering, or a post on social media. But it needs to acknowledge that she deliberately humiliated me and that her behavior was wrong. Eleanor's face was turning an interesting shade of purple. I will not be dictated to by your daughter-in-law who just discovered evidence of federal fraud, I interrupted. Eleanor, let me be very clear about your position here. I have evidence that you knew about the investigation into my finances. Your son hired a private investigator to research my inheritance prospects. That makes you complicit in financial manipulation. You're bluffing, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out a copy of a check Tom had written to Premier Investigations. Am I? Tom stared at the check. How did you find that? I found it because you left it in your filing cabinet. Apparently, you thought I was too stupid to ever look for information about my own family's finances. The family dynamics were fracturing in real time, exactly as I'd hoped. 25 years of watching them operate had taught me their individual pressure points. Eleanor's was her need to maintain the appearance of moral authority. James's was his fear of being excluded from business decisions. Tom's was his desperate need to avoid conflict. So, we're all in agreement that there was a deliberate, coordinated effort to research and manipulate my inheritance? I asked pleasantly. I want to make sure I understand the scope of the deception before I decide whether to involve law enforcement. It wasn't deception, Tom said desperately. We were just trying to plan for the family's future. Whose family, Tom? Because on Sunday, Eleanor made it very clear that I'm not part of the family you were planning for. Eleanor finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of her mistake. Margaret, I was upset about the surprise party planning. I didn't mean to exclude you from family decisions permanently. Didn't you? Because according to what I've discovered, the plan seems to have been to secure my inheritance money and then continue treating me exactly like you always have, as someone whose opinions don't matter. I stood up and walked to the coffee pot, refilling my cup with deliberate calm. The irony, of course, is that I never wanted your money. I wanted your respect. I wanted to be included, to be valued, to be treated like my opinions mattered. They do matter, Tom said weakly. Do they? When was the last time you asked my opinion about a major decision, Tom? When was the last time you included me in a family discussion before making plans that affected my life? He opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly unable to think of a single example. That's what I thought. I returned to my seat and looked at each of them in turn. Here's the reality. You can agree to my terms, and we can restructure this family dynamic as a partnership of equals. Or you can refuse, and I can pursue legal action while building a very comfortable, independent life for myself. You're not seriously considering divorce, Eleanor said. Eleanor, 2 weeks ago, I would have been horrified at the thought of divorce. Sunday morning, I would have done anything to make this family work. But sitting here now, looking at evidence of how thoroughly you've all betrayed my trust, I'm finding independence looks remarkably appealing. I pulled out my phone and showed them a text from Barbara Henderson. House closed successfully. Profit deposited, $35,000. Congratulations. By the way, Eleanor's house sold. I made a nice profit on a house purchased for a woman who didn't need it, with money obtained through deliberate emotional manipulation. Not a bad start to my independent financial portfolio. Tom reached across the table and touched my hand. Maggie, I love you. We can fix this. Can we, Tom? Because love without respect isn't actually love. It's just habit with convenient tax benefits. I didn't pull my hand away, but I didn't return the pressure either. If you want to fix this, you can start by proving that you're capable of treating me like an equal partner instead of a financial resource to be managed. James had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. What guarantee do we have that you won't use this information against us later, even if we agree to your terms? I smiled at him, recognizing the business mind that had helped build Davidson Construction into a multi-million-dollar operation. The same guarantee I've had for the past 25 years that you wouldn't lie to me, investigate me, or manipulate me like a potential criminal. None whatsoever. The difference is, now we all know where we stand. I closed Patricia's folder and stood up. I'm going back to my hotel room to pack. You have until noon tomorrow to decide whether you want a wife and daughter-in-law who's an equal partner, or whether you'd prefer to explain to the community why the Davidson family is facing various legal complications. As I reached the kitchen doorway, I turned back one final time. Oh, and Eleanor? The next time you want to test someone's generosity, maybe start with your own. I woke up the next morning to 17 missed calls from Tom and a voicemail that was either panic or genuine remorse. With Tom, it was often hard to tell the difference. Maggie, please don't do anything irreversible. We accept your terms, all of them. Just please come home so we can work this out. I listened to the message twice, analyzing the tone. Desperation, definitely. But whether it was desperation to avoid consequences or desperation to actually change remained to be seen. I called Patricia before I called Tom back. Good morning, Maggie. How did the family meeting go? About as well as expected. They've apparently agreed to my terms, but I want to make sure I have legal protections in place before I agree to anything. Smart thinking. What kind of protections? I want a formal agreement that spells out the financial transparency, the joint ownership transfers, and the decision-making equality. Something legally binding that I can enforce if they backslide. Patricia spent 20 minutes outlining how we could structure a post-nuptial agreement that would protect my interests while giving Tom a chance to rebuild our marriage on honest terms. By 10 o'clock, I had a draft agreement that was fair but firm. By noon, I was back at our house with Patricia, facing Tom, James, Eleanor, and their visibly uncomfortable attorney. Thank you all for coming, I began. I've had a legal agreement prepared that outlines exactly how our new family dynamic will work. I slid copies across the table. This post-nuptial agreement requires complete financial transparency, joint ownership of all marital assets, and equal decision-making authority in matters that affect our family. It also includes specific penalties for any future deception or manipulation. Tom was reading carefully, his face growing paler by the minute. Maggie, this is comprehensive. It needs to be comprehensive, Tom. Trust, once broken, requires extensive verification to rebuild. Eleanor finally found her voice. Margaret, this agreement essentially makes you an equal partner in the family business. That's exactly right, Eleanor. I'm offering to be the wife and daughter-in-law you should have wanted all along, someone who's fully invested in the family's success and treated accordingly. James looked up from reading. What about the federal loan issue? How do we handle that going forward? I exchanged glances with Patricia. That depends on whether there actually was fraud or just poor documentation. If the loans were legitimate and properly used, there's no problem. If they weren't, well, that's a conversation we need to have, honestly. Tom cleared his throat. Maggie, the loans were complicated, but they were legal. The money was used for business purposes, even if the paperwork wasn't perfectly clear about specifics. Then you'll have no problem providing complete documentation to support that claim. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Are you asking us to trust you with information that could potentially be used against us? James asked directly. I'm asking you to trust me with the same honesty you expect from me, I replied. For 25 years, I've trusted this family with my financial security, my emotional well-being, and my future. Now I'm asking for the same consideration in return. Eleanor had been studying the agreement with the focused attention of someone looking for loopholes. This apology requirement, what exactly are you expecting? I'm expecting you to acknowledge publicly that you deliberately excluded me from family discussions, that you accepted my financial help under false pretenses, and that your treatment of me was wrong. A simple statement of fact. And if I refuse? I leaned back in my chair, meeting her gaze steadily. Then you prove that you're more committed to protecting your pride than to having an honest relationship with your family. Tom reached across the table and took my hand. Maggie, I know I've made mistakes. Serious mistakes. But I want to fix this. I want us to have the marriage we should have had all along. For the first time since this ordeal began, Tom sounded like he actually understood what he'd done wrong. Then sign the agreement, I said simply. Prove that you want partnership instead of control. The next hour was spent reviewing details and answering questions from their attorney. By 3 o'clock, we had a legally binding agreement that gave me everything I'd asked for: financial transparency, equal decision-making authority, joint ownership of all marital assets, and a clear path forward. Eleanor signed her apology letter with obvious reluctance, but she signed it. Tom added my name to all the property deeds that afternoon. James provided complete business financial records and agreed to include me in all major business discussions going forward. That evening, sitting in our kitchen for the first time in over a week, I felt something I hadn't experienced in our marriage before: actual partnership. "Maggie," Tom said quietly as we cleaned up from dinner, "I need you to know that I understand what I did wrong. It wasn't just about hiding money. It was about not seeing you as an equal. What changed your mind?" He was quiet for a long moment, carefully drying the dish in his hands. "Watching you walk away, realizing that you were serious about building a life without us if we couldn't treat you right. I spent 25 years thinking you'd always be there no matter what we did. It never occurred to me that you might decide you deserved better. And now? Now I know that I married someone much stronger and smarter than I gave her credit for. And I know that if I want to stay married to you, I need to deserve it every day." It wasn't a perfect ending. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. Eleanor's apology was grudging rather than heartfelt. The business integration had its challenges, as I learned aspects of Davidson construction I'd never been allowed to see. But it was an honest beginning. 6 months later, I was reviewing quarterly financial reports in my new office at Davidson Construction, a real office with my name on the door and actual decision-making authority. The business was thriving under more transparent management, and my suggestions for expansion had already generated over $300,000 in new revenue. Eleanor and I would never be best friends, but we'd developed a respectful working relationship based on clear boundaries and mutual acknowledgement of each other's contributions to the family. Tom and I were learning what it felt like to be married to someone you actually respected. It was different from what we'd had before, less comfortable perhaps, but infinitely more genuine. The most important change wasn't financial or legal, though. It was psychological. I'd learned that demanding respect doesn't make you difficult. It makes you unavailable to people who have no intention of treating you well. I'd learned that sometimes the family you marry into isn't capable of change until they face the real possibility of losing you. And I'd learned that the strongest position you can take in any relationship is being genuinely willing to walk away if your fundamental needs aren't met. These days, when people ask me how I found the courage to stand up to my entire family, I tell them the truth. I didn't find courage. I found clarity. Clarity about what I deserved, what I was willing to accept, and what I was capable of building on my own. The Davidson family had spent 25 years teaching me that I needed them more than they needed me. Turns out we were all wrong about that. But unlike them, I was willing to learn from my mistakes. 2 weeks later, I thought we'd successfully navigated the crisis. The legal agreements were signed, the financial transparency was real, and Tom seemed genuinely committed to treating me as an equal partner. I was actually starting to believe we might build something better from the wreckage of our old dynamic. Then Agent Rebecca Martinez called. "Mrs. Davidson, this is Agent Martinez with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. We need to speak with you about Davidson Construction's federal loan applications." I was in my new office at Davidson Construction, reviewing vendor contracts when the call came. The words FBI Financial Crimes Unit made my blood go cold. "Agent Martinez, I'm not sure how I can help you." "Ma'am, we're investigating potential PPP loan fraud involving your family's business. We understand you've recently gained access to financial records that were previously hidden from you." My mind raced. "How did you know about that?" "Mrs. Davidson, we'd like to meet with you today if possible. This is a time-sensitive matter." 4 hours later, I was sitting in a conference room at the FBI field office in Springfield with Agent Martinez, Agent David Park, and Patricia Wells. The agents had laid out documents that made my stomach sink. "Mrs. Davidson," Agent Martinez began, "Davidson Construction applied for and received $847,000 in PPP loans in 2020 and 2021. These loans were forgiven based on certifications that the funds were necessary to maintain payroll during economic hardship." She slid a document across the table. "However, their tax returns for those same years show record profits and significant bonus payments to the owners." "That's fraud," I said quietly. Yes, ma'am. Federal fraud, which carries potential prison sentences of up to 20 years per count. Agent Park opened another folder. The investigation began 6 months ago when our automated audit system flagged the discrepancy between reported hardship and actual profits. We've since discovered additional irregularities. He showed me bank records I'd never seen before. The loan funds were used for personal expenditures rather than business payroll, vehicle purchases, real estate investments, significant cash withdrawals. I stared at records showing the purchase of a property in Cape Cod for $480,000, paid for entirely with PPP loan money. I've never heard of this property, I said. It's owned by a shell company registered to Eleanor Davidson. According to our investigation, it's been operating as a vacation rental property, generating unreported income. The scope of the deception was staggering. Not only had they hidden their wealth from me, they'd been committing federal crimes to increase it. Agent Martinez leaned forward. Mrs. Davidson, your name appears on some of the loan applications and tax returns. Technically, that makes you a potential co-conspirator. However, the evidence suggests you were deliberately excluded from any charges related to these financial crimes in exchange for your cooperation with our investigation. Agent Park slid an immunity agreement across the table. We need someone with inside access to help us document their criminal activities and recover the stolen funds. I stared at the document, thinking about Tom's promises of honesty and partnership, about Eleanor's grudging apology, about the family dinners we'd been sharing while they sat on evidence of federal crimes. If I cooperate, what happens to them? If convicted, your husband and brother-in-law could face 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Your mother-in-law could face 10 to 15 years. And if I don't cooperate, the investigation continues without your assistance, but you remain a potential target for prosecution based on your name appearing on fraudulent documents. Patricia had been reading through the immunity agreement carefully. Maggie, this is actually an excellent deal. Full immunity, witness protection if needed, and federal assistance with asset recovery. Asset recovery? Agent Martinez nodded. When we seize their assets as proceeds of criminal activity, you'll be entitled to recover any marital property or funds that rightfully belong to you. Given the scope of the fraud, that could be substantial. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 weeks ago, desperate for Eleanor's approval, grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion the Davidson family threw me. That woman would have been horrified at the thought of helping to send her family to federal prison. The woman I'd become was primarily curious about justice being served. Agent Martinez, what exactly would my cooperation involve? We'd like you to continue your normal family interactions while documenting any discussions of the fraudulent loans, the hidden assets, or attempts to conceal evidence. We can provide recording equipment. You want me to spy on my family? Mrs. Davidson, your family has been committing federal crimes while using your name on legal documents without your knowledge. They've made you an unwitting accomplice to fraud that could result in decades in federal prison. I picked up the pen and signed the immunity agreement. When do we start? The recording device was smaller than I'd expected, disguised as a pen that would capture every conversation clearly. 2 days later, I was sitting in our kitchen during what Tom thought was a normal family breakfast, documenting federal crimes in real time. I'm still worried about the Cape Cod property, Eleanor was saying to James. If anyone starts asking questions about Griffin Holdings, Mom, the shell company is clean, James replied. There's no direct connection to Davidson Construction on the paperwork. But the money trail shows legitimate business expenses, Tom interrupted. Real estate investment for corporate retreats. Completely defensible. I buttered my toast calmly while listening to my family discuss how to hide evidence of federal fraud. What about the cash withdrawals? Eleanor pressed. Those look suspicious. Cash bonuses for contract workers, Tom said smoothly. Perfectly normal in construction. Except we never paid cash bonuses to contract workers, James pointed out. Nobody can prove that, Tom replied. Agent Martinez had been right. They were discussing their crimes with casual confidence because they'd never imagined being overheard. The recording would be damning evidence. Tom, I said pleasantly, could you pass the jam? Of course, honey. He handed it over with a smile, completely unaware that he'd just confessed to multiple federal crimes while his wife recorded every word. That afternoon, I met with Agent Martinez to review the recordings. "This is excellent evidence," she said, listening to Tom's explanation of the corporate retreat property. "We have them discussing the shell company, the loan money, and the cover story. This will be very useful in court. How much more evidence do you need? We'd like you to try to get them to discuss the original loan applications. Specifically, who knew they were making false claims about financial hardship. And then? Then we arrest them. And we arrest. Probably within the next week." I drove home thinking about the strange turns my life had taken. A month ago, I'd been fighting for respect in a family that didn't value me. Now, I was helping federal agents build criminal cases against those same family members. That evening, Tom brought up the subject I'd been hoping for. "Maggie, I've been thinking about our conversation with Patricia about complete honesty," he said over dinner. "There are some aspects of the business finances that I should probably explain more fully." "Oh? The PPP loans we received during the pandemic. The paperwork was complicated, and we may have been overly optimistic about our needs assessment." Eleanor nearly choked on her wine. "Thomas, we agreed not to." "It's okay, Mom. Maggie's family now. She should understand how we protected the business during uncertain times." James was staring at Tom like he'd lost his mind, but Tom continued obliviously. "The truth is, we weren't really in financial difficulty. But the loans were available, and we qualified on paper, so we took advantage of the opportunity." "You lied on the applications?" I asked innocently. "Not lied exactly, just presented our situation in the most favorable light for loan approval." "Tom," James said sharply, "maybe we should discuss this privately." "Why? Maggie's a business partner now. She should understand how these things work." The recording pen was capturing every word of Tom's casual admission to federal fraud. "How did you use the loan money?" I asked. "Smart investments. The Cape Cod property has been generating excellent rental income. Much better return than just keeping the money in payroll accounts." Eleanor was frantically shaking her head at Tom, but he was too focused on impressing me with his business acumen to notice. Of course, we had to be careful about the documentation, make sure everything looked legitimate for the government auditors. "How did you do that?" "Creative accounting. James set up some shell companies to make the transactions look like standard business expenses." James stood up abruptly. "Tom, this conversation is over." "Why? Maggie's not going to report us to the FBI." Tom laughed at the absurdity of the idea. "No," I said quietly, standing up from the table. "I'm not going to report you to the FBI." I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the surveillance van parked discreetly down the block. I already did. The silence that followed was deafening. Tom's face went white. "What?" I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, showing them Agent Martinez's contact information in my recent calls. "The FBI contacted me a week ago about potential PPP loan fraud. They offered me immunity in exchange for cooperation. I accepted." Eleanor stood up slowly, her face a mask of fury. "You betrayed your own family." "Did I? Or did I refuse to go to federal prison for crimes I didn't commit?" Tom was staring at me like I was a stranger. "Maggie, we're your family. How could you do this to us?" "Family?" I laughed, that bitter sound that had become my signature. "Tom, 2 weeks ago you were still hiding financial crimes from me while pretending to embrace honesty and partnership. Through the window, I could see federal agents getting out of vehicles and approaching the house. You want to know how I could do this? Easy. You taught me that the Davidson family motto is, 'Every person for themselves.' I learned that lesson very well." The front door opened and Agent Martinez entered with several other agents. "Good evening, everyone. Thomas Davidson, James Davidson, Eleanor Davidson. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and making false statements to the federal government." As they read Miranda rights to my family, I gathered my purse and headed for the door. Tom called out desperately, "Maggie, this isn't over. We're still married. You can't testify against me." I turned back one final time. "Actually, Tom, I can. Spousal privilege doesn't apply when the spouse is a cooperating witness with immunity." "This will destroy you too," Eleanor hissed as the agents handcuffed her. "Eleanor, I've been destroyed and rebuilt twice in the past month. I'm getting pretty good at it." As I walked out of the house where I'd spent 25 years being undervalued and deceived, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Pure, uncomplicated relief that I would never again have to pretend that people who treated me badly were doing it out of love. 18 months later, I was standing on the deck of my new home, a renovated Victorian house I'd purchased with the proceeds from the asset recovery case. The view overlooked Millbrook Harbor, and on clear mornings like this one, I could see all the way to the islands. Davidson Property Investment had become the most successful small-scale development company in the county. My business partner, Mike Sullivan, the contractor who'd left Davidson Construction after his dispute with Tom, had proven to be everything Tom never was: honest, respectful, and genuinely collaborative. "Morning, Maggie," Mike called from the construction site next door, where we were renovating our third property this year. "Coffee's ready when you are." "Be right there," I called back. The federal cases had concluded 6 months ago. Tom was serving 12 years in federal prison after additional fraud charges were discovered during the investigation. James received 15 years when the FBI uncovered his embezzlement from city contracts. Eleanor, at 78, was serving 6 years in minimum security prison. The Cape Cod property had become my Cape Cod property after the asset forfeiture proceedings. The rental income that had been hidden from the IRS now funded a very comfortable lifestyle and a growing real estate portfolio. But the most satisfying outcome wasn't financial. The most satisfying outcome was discovering that when you stop accepting unacceptable treatment, your life becomes remarkably peaceful. My phone rang as I walked to the construction site. Patricia Wells, calling with the final paperwork from the divorce settlement. "Good morning, Maggie. I have excellent news. The last of Tom's hidden assets have been recovered. After legal fees, you're looking at an additional $400,000. "That's wonderful news, Patricia. There's something else. Tom's attorney has been calling about a possible prison visit. Apparently, he's written you several letters asking for reconciliation when he's released." I poured myself coffee from Mike's thermos and looked out at the harbor where fishing boats were heading out for the day. "Send the letters back unopened, Patricia. Same as always." "Are you sure? 12 years is a long time. People can change." I thought about that for a moment. "Patricia, people can change, but they have to want to change for the right reasons. Tom doesn't want to change because he realizes he treated me badly. He wants to change because he's facing the consequences of treating me badly. That's a fair distinction. Besides, I'm too busy building the life I actually want to waste time rebuilding relationships with people who spent decades proving they didn't value what they had." After hanging up with Patricia, I walked over to where Mike was reviewing the renovation plans for our current project. "How's the timeline looking?" I asked. "Right on schedule. We should have this one ready for market in 6 weeks. I've got 3 potential buyers already interested based on the photos alone." Mike and I had discovered we made an excellent team. He brought construction expertise and project management skills. I brought financial acumen and an eye for properties with hidden potential. Our partnership was profitable, efficient, and built on complete mutual respect. "Mike, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you ever wonder how different your life might have been if you'd stayed at Davidson Construction?" He considered the question while reviewing our cost projections. "Honestly, I think I'd probably be in federal prison right now, either as a co-conspirator or because I would have eventually blown the whistle and Tom would have tried to frame me for something." "Any regrets about leaving?" "Only that I waited so long to realize I deserved better than working for people who didn't respect my contributions." I smiled at that. Mike had learned the same lesson I had, just in a different context. That afternoon, I drove past the old Davidson Construction building. It had been seized by the federal government and was now for sale at a significant discount. I'd considered buying it, but ultimately decided I had no interest in owning symbols of my old life. Instead, I drove to Sunset Manor, Eleanor's former assisted living facility, where I was meeting with the director about a potential business opportunity. "Mrs. Davidson, or should I say, Ms. Thompson?" Helen Morrison smiled as I entered her office. I'd legally reverted to my maiden name after the divorce. "Ms. Thompson is perfect. I've reviewed your proposal for the senior living renovation project. It's quite ambitious. It's quite needed. This community deserves better senior housing options than what's currently available." Helen spread the architectural plans across her desk. A 100-unit assisted living complex with modern amenities, therapy facilities, and dedicated memory care units. The budget projections look realistic. Mike Sullivan and I have successfully completed 5 similar projects in other counties. We understand the unique requirements of senior housing construction. "And your financing." I smiled. thinking about the irony of funding senior living improvements with money recovered from people who'd spent years complaining about the cost of supporting elderly family members. Fully secured through private investment and federal development grants. We can break ground as soon as permits are approved. Helen signed the preliminary agreement that afternoon. By evening, I had my 6th major development project under contract and a clear plan for expanding into the senior living market. That night, I sat on my deck with a glass of wine, watching the sunset over the harbor and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. A year and a half ago, I'd been fighting for scraps of respect from people who saw me as a convenient resource to be managed and controlled. Today, I was a successful business owner, a respected community member, and someone who'd learned that demanding better treatment doesn't make you difficult. It makes you unavailable to people who have no intention of treating you well. The best part wasn't the money or the business success, though both were satisfying. The best part was waking up every morning in a life I'd chosen, surrounded by people who valued my contributions, building something meaningful with partners who saw me as an equal. Tom had been wrong about many things, but he'd been especially wrong about his assumption that I needed the Davidson family more than they needed me. Turns out I didn't need them at all. I just needed to believe I deserved better than what I was accepting. The knock on my door came on a rainy Tuesday evening in October, exactly 2 years after the FBI arrests. I was reviewing proposals for the senior living center when I heard the familiar pattern. 3 quick knocks, pause, 2 more knocks. Eleanor's signature from years of family dinners. But Eleanor was in federal prison. I opened the door to find James Davidson standing on my porch, looking like he'd aged a decade in the past 2 years. He was thinner, grayer, and carrying himself with the defeated posture of a man who'd lost everything. "Hello, Maggie. It's Ms. Thompson now, and you're not supposed to be here, James. Your parole agreement specifically prohibits contact with me." "I know, but I had to talk to you before I left town permanently." Despite my better judgment, I let him in. James had always been the least malicious of the Davidson family members, and curiosity got the better of me. 5 minutes, I said, not offering him coffee or a seat. James remained standing in my entryway, looking around at the renovated house with what might have been genuine admiration. "You've done well for yourself." "I've done honestly for myself. There's a difference." "Yes, there is." James met my eyes directly for the first time since he'd entered. "That's actually why I'm here. I wanted to apologize for what we put you through, and to tell you something you have a right to know." "I'm listening." "The FBI investigation didn't begin because of automated audits like they told you. It began because I contacted them 6 months before they contacted you." I stared at him, processing this revelation. "You were the original whistleblower?" "Yes. I'd been watching Tom and Mom manipulate you for years, watching the business finances get more and more creative, watching the PPP fraud happen in real time. When you bought that house for Mom, and she still excluded you from the family meeting, I realized they were never going to treat you fairly no matter what you did for them. So you called the FBI?" "I called the FBI, provided them with financial records, and agreed to make recordings of family conversations. I've been cooperating for over 8 months before they approached you. The implications were staggering. You were recording us during those kitchen table meetings? Every conversation for months, the business meetings, the family dinners, the discussions about hiding money, all of it." I walked to my living room window, looking out at the rain and trying to understand why James was telling me this now. "Why?" I asked finally. "Why did you turn on your own family?" James sat down heavily on my couch without invitation. "Because they weren't acting like family. Family doesn't systematically exploit and manipulate each other. Family doesn't commit federal crimes while making their relatives unwitting accomplices. But you participated in the crimes too." "I did. And I've served my time, and I'll live with the consequences for the rest of my life. But I wasn't willing to watch them destroy you in the process." I turned back to face him. "James, you still went to prison. If you were cooperating, why didn't you get immunity like I did?" "Because I was guilty. I helped create the shell companies. I processed the fraudulent loan applications. I set up the hidden accounts. Cooperation reduced my sentence, but it couldn't eliminate my culpability. And now? Now I'm moving to Oregon to work construction for a company that's willing to hire ex-felons. I wanted to see you before I left, to tell you that watching you refuse to accept our treatment of you was the catalyst for everything that followed." James stood up and headed for the door. "You deserved so much better than what we gave you, Maggie. I'm sorry it took federal prison sentences to make that clear." "James, wait." He turned back. "Thank you for telling me the truth. Finally." He nodded and walked out into the rain. After he left, I sat in my living room trying to absorb this final revelation. James had been protecting me long before I'd learned to protect myself. His decision to contact the FBI had ultimately saved me from potential prosecution while ensuring that the people who'd exploited me faced consequences for their actions. The next morning, I called Agent Martinez. "Ms. Thompson, good to hear from you. How are you settling into your new life?" "Very well, thank you." "Agent Martinez, I had an interesting conversation yesterday with James Davidson. He told me he was your original source for the investigation." "Yes, that's correct. Mr. Davidson contacted us 8 months before we approached you. His cooperation was instrumental in building our case. Why didn't you tell me that when we first met? We don't typically reveal our sources, even to other cooperating witnesses. Mr. Davidson specifically requested that his role be kept confidential until after his release from prison. He was trying to protect me, even while he was going to prison himself. Mr. Davidson made it clear from our first conversation that his primary concern was ensuring you weren't prosecuted for crimes you weren't aware of. His cooperation was motivated largely by his desire to protect you from his family's criminal activity. After hanging up with Agent Martinez, I realized that the Davidson family story wasn't quite as simple as I'd thought. James had seen the same problems I'd seen, but he'd acted to correct them before I'd even recognized the full scope of the deception. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I wrote a letter to someone in federal prison. "Dear James, thank you for yesterday's conversation and for the truth about your role in the investigation. I understand now that you were protecting me long before I learned to protect myself. I want you to know that your decision to cooperate with the FBI was the right choice, regardless of the personal cost. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting responsibility for your mistakes while ensuring that others don't continue to be harmed. I hope your new life in Oregon brings you the peace and honest relationships that none of us had in the Davidson family dynamic. Your former sister-in-law, Margaret Thompson." I mailed the letter that evening, along with a small check to help him get established in his new life. The Davidson family had taught me many lessons over the years. But the final lesson came from the family member I'd least expected, that redemption is possible when someone chooses to protect others instead of protecting themselves. James had gone to federal prison, lost his business, and destroyed his financial future to ensure that I wouldn't be destroyed along with the rest of them. It was the most generous thing anyone in the Davidson family had ever done for me, and it had taken federal criminal charges to make it happen. 5 years after that rainy October evening, I was standing in the lobby of the Thompson Senior Living Center, watching workers install a dedication plaque that read, "Dedicated to building communities where every person is valued and respected." The 100-unit facility had been operating at full capacity for 18 months and had already received recognition as a model for senior care in rural communities. But that morning brought a surprise visitor that forced me to confront the final chapter of my Davidson family story. The woman who approached me was elegant, silver-haired, and moving slowly with the aid of a walker. It took me several moments to recognize Eleanor Davidson, aged by federal prison and diminished by the consequences of her choices. "Margaret," she said quietly, "or I suppose it's Ms. Thompson now." "Eleanor, you're not supposed to be here. Your parole restrictions include avoiding contact with prosecution witnesses." "Yes, but I'm dying, Margaret. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors give me 2 months, perhaps 3. I looked at the woman who had spent 25 years making me feel unwelcome in my own family, now reduced to seeking me out for what was clearly a final conversation. "What do you want, Eleanor?" "I want to apologize. Really apologize. Not the grudging letter I wrote as part of the legal settlement. I want to tell you that you were right about everything." Eleanor moved slowly to one of the comfortable chairs in the lobby, and after a moment's hesitation, I sat across from her. The financial manipulation, the emotional cruelty, the deliberate exclusion from family decisions, all of it was wrong. We treated you like an outsider while expecting you to finance our lifestyle. We investigated your inheritance prospects like you were a business opportunity instead of family. Why are you telling me this now?" Eleanor's voice was weaker than I remembered, but her words were clearer than they'd ever been. "Because I've had 4 years in federal prison to think about what we did to you, and because I watched the news coverage of this place and realized what you've built with your life since leaving us." She gestured around the elegant lobby where residents were reading, playing chess, and chatting with visiting family members. "This senior living center, your development company, your reputation in the community, you've become everything we never allowed you to be. You've built success based on treating people with dignity and respect, which is exactly what we failed to do with you." I studied Eleanor's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but finding only exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine regret. "Eleanor, I appreciate the apology, but it doesn't change anything. The damage was done long ago." "I know. I'm not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. I'm asking you to understand that you were never the problem. The problem was a family that couldn't see value in someone who didn't fight for dominance." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. "There's something else. Something you should know about Tom." "I don't want to hear about Tom. He's been writing letters to everyone he can think of, trying to find your address. He's convinced that when he gets out of prison, he can win you back. He thinks his incarceration has taught him to value you properly." "Has it?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "Margaret, I've received dozens of letters from Tom over the past 5 years. Not once has he acknowledged that his treatment of you was wrong. He talks about missing you, about wanting to rebuild your marriage, about the financial stability you could have together. But he's never actually said that you deserved better treatment or that he was wrong to control and deceive you." She handed me the envelope. "These are copies of his recent letters to me. I thought you should see them before he's released next year." I opened the envelope and read through letters that were both heartbreaking and infuriating. Tom writing about how much he missed our partnership, how he'd learned to appreciate my contributions, how we could be successful together when he was released. Not one word acknowledging that I deserved honesty and respect all along. Not one recognition that the problem wasn't my failure to appreciate him, but his failure to value me. "He still doesn't understand," I said finally. "No, he doesn't. Tom learned that his actions had consequences, but he never learned why his actions were wrong. He thinks this whole experience was about punishment for financial crimes. He doesn't understand that it was about the consequences of treating someone who loved him like she was disposable." Eleanor stood up slowly, leaning heavily on her walker. "I wanted to warn you that he'll probably try to contact you when he's released. And I wanted you to know that not everyone in our family was blind to what we were doing to you. Why does this matter to you now, Eleanor?" She paused at the lobby entrance, looking back at me with something that might have been genuine sadness. "Because I realized that in 25 years of being your mother-in-law, I never once told you that you were a good wife to my son. You were patient, generous, supportive, and loyal. You deserved a family that valued those qualities instead of taking advantage of them. Eleanor, Margaret, you built something beautiful here. You're treating strangers with more dignity and care than we ever treated you. That tells me everything I need to know about your character and everything I need to acknowledge about ours." After Eleanor left, I sat in the lobby for a long time, watching the afternoon activity of residents and staff members who treated each other with the kind of basic respect I'd fought for and eventually found. That evening, I called Mike Sullivan, who'd become not just my business partner, but one of my closest friends. "Eleanor Davidson visited me today," I told him over dinner at our favorite restaurant. "Prison release? Terminal cancer. She wanted to apologize and warn me that Tom will be contacting me when he gets out next year." Mike considered this while finishing his salmon. "Are you worried about that?" "Not worried exactly, but curious about how I'll respond. 5 years ago, I might have been tempted to see if he'd actually changed. And now?" I thought about the life I'd built, the business I'd created, the relationships I'd developed based on mutual respect and honest communication. Now I know that change requires more than just learning from consequences. It requires understanding why your behavior was wrong in the first place. Tom learned that lying and manipulation have legal penalties, but he never learned that I deserved truth and respect from the beginning. So what will you do when he contacts you? The same thing I did with his letters from prison. send them back unopened. No curiosity about what he has to say? I smiled, thinking about the woman I'd been 10 years ago who would have been desperate to hear any acknowledgement from Tom, even a flawed one. Mike, I spent 25 years trying to earn respect from people who weren't capable of giving it. I'm not spending my 60s trying to teach respect to people who still don't understand why it matters. 2 months later, I received notification that Eleanor Davidson had died in hospice care. She'd left a small bequest to the Senior Living Center in recognition of excellence in treating people with dignity. I used the money to establish a scholarship fund for women over 50 who wanted to start their own businesses. Eleanor's final gift wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It was recognition that the life I'd built after leaving her family was exactly the life I'd deserved all along. 6 months after that, Tom Davidson was released from federal prison. True to Eleanor's warning, he began attempting to contact me immediately. Letters sent to my old address and forwarded to my new one. Phone calls to Davidson Property Investment that my assistant intercepted. Even an attempt to visit the Senior Living Center that was blocked by security. Each letter and message was returned unopened, exactly as I'd promised myself. Because I'd learned the most important lesson of my adult life. You can't love someone into respecting you, and you can't explain your worth to people who are determined not to see it. The Davidson family had spent 25 years teaching me that I was convenient, but not valuable, useful, but not respected, needed, but not cherished. It had taken FBI investigations and federal prison sentences for me to understand that their assessment of my worth said nothing about my actual value and everything about their character. These days, I wake up every morning in a life built on honest relationships, successful partnerships, and genuine mutual respect. I'm surrounded by people who value my contributions, appreciate my thoughts, and treat me like the equal partner I'd always wanted to be. And when people ask me how I found the courage to walk away from everything familiar to build something better, I tell them the truth. I didn't find courage. I found clarity. Clarity about what I deserved, what I was willing to accept, and what I was capable of building when I stopped trying to make other people see my worth. The Davidson family taught me that respect can't be demanded from people who are determined not to give it. But they also taught me that respect can be found with people who understand its value. I chose to spend my time with the people who already understood, and that choice made all the difference. The story we tell is fictional, but it is inspired by real events. The names and places have been changed to protect the identities of those involved. We don't tell this to judge, but in the hope that someone will listen and stop to think how many people are suffering in silence within their own families. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.